In our previous notes, we talked about taking the conditional statement and turning it in the inverse and the converse and the inverse. We're going to talk about two other ways of changing that conditional statement, and it's going to be your contrapositive and your biconditional statement. First, just to recap, we have our conditional statement. We'll just, real quickly go through and hit up the main points. We remember, like we discussed in the previous notes, our conditional statement is an if-then format. You have your hypothesis, your P, okay? It's everything that is after the word if. It's after if and before the period. Then you have your conclusion, after if and before the comma, and then your conclusion is after then and before the period. Okay, again, your conditional statement, we looked at the symbols as this is if P, then Q. So if your hypothesis, then your conclusion. Your converse, we talked about, we switch them. So we have if Q, then P. The inverse, we talked about, you're taking that conditional, and this is what I want to make sure we see here. We're taking the conditional statement and we're negating both of them, or we're doing the opposite, okay? The inverse means opposite, as we remember, okay? If we want to rewrite that back in, we can. Remember, this means opposites. We're saying, what is it saying? We're going to say the opposite now. So this is the symbol here with that little squiggly negation. So if not P, then not Q. Now our contrapositive. Your contrapositive is going to be the converse and the inverse mixed together. But what we can take a look at is the contrapositive of a conditional statement. You're going to negate both the hypothesis and conclusion, just like the inverse, but you're going to do it to the converse. That's the big thing right there, okay, is you're going to take the converse and you're going to negate both of those, or take the opposite of both of those. The way I look at it is contrapositive is a really long word. It's longer than converse and inverse. So the really long word, you're going to do a lot more work. So you're technically doing the converse and the inverse together. But I think a nicer way of looking at it is you take your converse, if Q then P, and you do the opposite, that negation, that not Q then not P. Okay? Your biconditional statement is going to be, it's a statement where the conditional and the converse are both true. So you're not actually going to have an if-then statement now. You're going to have that if, you're going to have it between. You're going to take off the if and then, and between the hypothesis conclusion, you're inserting the words if and only if. On multiple choice, this is the easiest one to find. If I say find the biconditional, find the if and only if. So that's why the arrow goes both directions here. It's saying P if and only if Q. Now there are a couple things to note here, and this is when we start talking about validity. Okay? Your conditional statement and its contrapositive are either both true or both false. So if one's true, the other one has to be true. If one's false, the other has to be false. This is your original and the very, very last one we're learning today. Okay? Same thing as your verses, converse, inverse. Your converse and inverse, your verses, are both true or both false. Okay? So that's just our front little fact page. And then we will take a look now at our first example. And this is the exact same example as we had in the previous notes about the converse and inverse. We have everything filled out for us this time. Okay, we have letting P, our hypothesis, be you are a guitar player, and Q, our conclusion, being you are a musician. So here, our conditional, we wrote in the previous notes, if you are a guitar player, then you are a musician. So our hypothesis right here, not including the word if, our conclusion right here. Now remember that this is if P, then Q. And we noted in our notes yesterday that this is a true fact, a true statement. Our converse, we're switching, if Q, then P. So we see that our conclusion, you're a musician, comes first, and your hypothesis, you are a guitar player, comes second. We noted here that this was a false statement. Your inverse, we saw here that we kept our hypothesis and our conclusion in the same spots, but we said if not P, then not Q. So we said the opposite. So if you are not a guitar player, see in that word not, then you are not a musician. That's that negation or that change into the opposite. And we did note that this was false. Our contrapositive, what we're going to do is we're going to come up here to our converse. And we're going to do like what we did with inverse. We took conditional and we said the opposite of each one. But now we're going to look at our contrapositive and our converse. So we're going to take that if Q, then P. But we'll say if not Q, then not P. Okay, so we have those negations there. But now the conclusion comes first and the hypothesis comes second. So here we're going to take our converse, and instead of you are a musician, what is the opposite of saying you are a musician? You are not a musician, sorry. So you say if you are not a musician, one of these days I'll get better at this writing, comma. So we have our conclusion first, but we have that opposite, that negation there. Then we want to take that you are a guitar player and we want to say the opposite. Well, what's the opposite of you are a guitar player? You are not a guitar player. So here we said, then you are not a guitar player. So again, we have that negation, but we also have our hypothesis second. So as you can see, we've taken the converse and the inverse, and we've done both of them. We've switched and we've negated, and that's what the contrapositive does. Now when you look at this, you look at contrapositive, says if you are not a musician, then you are not a guitar player. Well, if you're not a musician, technically you don't play an instrument, so you're not a guitar player. So this could be true. But then again, you could look at it, honestly, if you're really getting down to the nitty-gritty. If you're not a musician, you're not a guitar player. But I mean, you could be practicing or learning, but technically this would be a true statement. Now, this is one situation that your biconditional actually would not exist. Because if we look back at the first definition here, our biconditional is when both the conditional and the converse are true. And if you look at your conditional and your converse, they are not both true. So technically your biconditional would not exist with this situation. But we're going to go ahead and still use it, and we're going to go ahead and just write in it as if the biconditional did exist. So this is going to be your P if and only if Q. So we're going to take our conditional statement at the very, very top, and we're going to drop off that word if and drop off the word then. Between the hypothesis and the conclusion, so between what I have in pink and blue, we're going to insert those words if and only if. So here we'll put in, drop off if, and we'll say, let me put my black ink, sorry. You are a guitar player. No comma or anything, but then you're going to have that if and only if. So there's that biconditional recognition there. You can see that's going to be your biconditional, because you see that if and only if. And then we'll go ahead and plug in our conclusion here. You are a musician. So it says you are a guitar player, our hypothesis, if and only if you are a musician. And with that being said, you're a guitar player if and only if you're a musician. This would be a true statement. And the validity of this is a little bit rough, okay? Because like I said, technically a biconditional would not exist because the conditional and the converse both have to be true. So let's take a look at the next one. Again, I'm just pulling straight from the previous problems here, the previous examples we had on the last notes. And we have here, if two lines intersect to form a right angle, then they are perpendicular. So we took our converse and we switched. Converse is switching. So we have, if two lines are perpendicular, which is fine. I know in my notes I put if they are perpendicular lines. But again, the perpendicular and the right angle are the big things that we need, the two different sections we need to look at. Then they intersect to form a right angle. All we did was switch them. Your inverse, we kept them in the right, our hypothesis first. We had the two lines intersecting to form a 90-degree angle. And we had our conclusion that they are perpendicular. We just said the opposite, those knots right there. Okay? So now our contrapositive, we're going to take our converse. If two lines are perpendicular, then they intersect to form a right angle, and we're going to change we're going to change both of them to say the opposite. So if two lines are perpendicular, well, what's the opposite of two lines are perpendicular? Two lines are not perpendicular. So here we'd say if two lines are not perpendicular, comma, so here we have two lines are perpendicular, we've got our conclusion part of it, but we have the opposite, negation of it. Then we take, then they intersect to form a right angle. Well, what's the opposite of saying they intersect to form a right angle? They do not intersect to form a right angle. So then they do not intersect to form a right angle. So again, that intersect to form a right angle is part of that hypothesis, but we have that negation there. We have that do not. Your biconditional, again, you go back up to your conditional statement. If two lines intersect to form a right angle, then they are perpendicular lines. We're going to take off if, and we're going to take off then. And instead, where then is, we're going to put if and only if. So we start off here with two lines intersect to form a right angle. Take off that if. We have two lines intersect to form a right angle. No comma, no then. We're inserting that if and only if. Then complete it with, not the word then, but your conclusion. They are perpendicular lines. They are perpendicular lines. And we can still see our hypothesis right here. And we can still see our conclusion. It's just now there's no if or then. We just have our hypothesis and conclusion being joined with that if and only if between the two of them. Let's take a look at example 3. We had if an animal is a mammal, that it breathes through lungs. So there is our hypothesis. An animal is an angle, or angle is a mammal, and our conclusion was it breathes through lungs. We looked at the converse. We took the hypothesis and conclusion. We switched them. So now we have if an animal breathes through lungs, then it is a mammal. So we've switched that breathe through lungs and the mammal part. I know in my class and on the video we actually said if it breathes through lungs, then it is a mammal. But again, as long as we're carrying that mammal and breathes through lungs with the hypothesis and conclusion, we can switch them and reword it a little bit differently. So next we took the inverse and we had if an animal is not a mammal, then it does not breathe through lungs. And we changed it to say the opposite. And that's just a review of what we did with our inverse. Contrapositive, again, new practice. We're going to come up here to our converse. We're going to take if an animal breathes through its lungs, then it is a mammal. And we're going to say the opposite of both the conclusion and the hypothesis. So here we're going to, instead of if an animal breathes through its lungs, we'd say if an animal does not breathe through its lungs. So if an animal does not breathe through its lungs, comma, so we have that conclusion part, the breathing, basically that big old breathe through its lungs, okay, but we have the does not. making sure that we see that we've negated it. Then, on our converse, we have it is a mammal. So we need to say the opposite of it is a mammal, and it is not a mammal. So then it is not a mammal. So there's that hypothesis part of it. Again, we're negating it. So we're going to the converse and saying the opposite of each one rather than the conditional statement. Again, with your biconditional, go all the way back up to your original conditional statement. We're going to drop off that word if and start with our hypothesis. An animal is a mammal. So an animal is a mammal. No comma. We're going to drop off the comma and the then, and we're going to insert those infamous biconditional words, if and only if. So if and only if. Right there. I'll go ahead and highlight that now. That's an important part. And then we go ahead and fill in the conclusion part. It breathes through lungs. So now we're reading the biconditional. An animal is a mammal if and only if it breathes through lungs. So we're taking the hypothesis and the conclusion. Remember, they do not involve the if and then. We're just putting the words if and only if between the hypothesis and the conclusion. Our last one that we looked at was our conditional statement was if two angles are complementary. So that two angles are complementary is our hypothesis. Then conclusion is their measures add up to exactly 90 degrees. We took the converse. We knew to switch them, switch your hypothesis and conclusion. So we said two angles measures add up to exactly 90 degrees. Then they are complementary. So we took the 90-degree measurement and the complementary angles. We switched them around. The inverse, we took that conditional statement and we said the opposite. So instead of if two angles are complementary, we said if two angles are not complementary. Again, hopefully you saw these notes either with your teacher or you've watched the video if you were not in class before you do this, so this is going to be really confusing. Probably should say that at the beginning of the video. And we took their measures add up to exactly 90 degrees, and we said the opposite. Their measures do not add up to exactly 90 degrees. So we have that negation. Again, moving on to the new one, the contrapositive. We're going to go back up to the converse, and we're going to say the opposite of each one. So the first thing we had is if two angles add up to exactly 90 degrees. So instead of saying they add up to 90 degrees, we're saying they do not add up to 90 degrees. So if I'm going to put the number two angles measures, it should say measures plural, sorry, do not add up. I'm just going to put 90 degrees, save some time here, 90 degrees, comma. So we have that conclusion part first, just like the converse, but we have the negation, the opposite of it. Then, instead of they are complementary angles, we would say they are not complementary angles. Again, sorry about the sloppy handwriting with these things. I'm trying, but I also don't want to take up too much time. So here's your hypothesis part of it, but we're changing it to the opposite. Our biconditional, remember we're taking our hypothesis and we're taking our conclusion. We're taking off that if and that then. So we start off, take off the if, and start off with our hypothesis here. Two angles are complementary. A lot of silence. Two angles are complementary. Then we'll replace that word then with the infamous if and only if that biconditional is. You can think of it as bi as two, like bicycle, two wheels. Biconditional, we're going to have two ifs, if and only if. So here's our if and only if, and then complete it with our conclusion. Their measures add up to exactly 90 degrees. So here we have our hypothesis, two angles are complementary. Then we have our if and only if biconditional characteristic here. And in our conclusion, their measures add up to exactly 90 degrees. That one, other than the conditional, I feel like that was the easiest. Just write the hypothesis, the if and only if, and then write the conclusion, and you're done with the biconditional.